All right, AI in procurement. So let's talk about what it really is, because what is today marketed as AI in procurement is mostly the same old invoice processing along with some chatbots, and your team is still doing most of the manual work. Now, I have personally worked with hundreds of growing companies in automating their procurement and AP process and how to use AI in those processes. So in this video, I'm going to break down exactly how to use AI in your procurement and AP process to reduce the invoice processing time, automate the invoice or purchase order approvals, and get better spend visibility. Let's get into it. So at a very basic level, AI in procurement is handling the job that your team does on a regular basis. So whether it is getting a purchase order approved, uploading an invoice into the system, matching the invoice, routing it for approval, or maybe following up with stakeholders for invoices where an exception is there and it needs to be resolved. Now, the point here is not to help humans do the work faster. The purpose of AI is to pretty much automate the work or the process so that the human is in the loop, but they are not the one actually doing the work, but they're actually looking at exceptions that are happening in the system. But most software vendors are actually labeling their current solutions as AI now, and with a little bit of, I would say, support, but your team is still doing most of the work. And that defeats the purpose of putting AI in your process. So the problem is AI gets slapped on any software nowadays, as what you know. So there are kind of two extremes we can talk about here, right? On the one extreme is what we call intelligent AI, which is actually understanding your spend patterns, understanding your coding history, like GL coding history, how the invoices has been coded in the past, and then using that knowledge to actually code the new invoices that are coming in. So it is actually automating your work, but it is learning from the data that you already have in place. And on the other extreme is same old OCR or data which is now positioned as AI. Like for example, our AI tool can actually read your invoices and automatically create the invoice. That has been in existence for decades, right? It has become better, but fundamentally everybody uses OCR to pull the data from invoices. Or recently I've seen many vendors talking about taking a vendor code and importing that as a purchase requisition as AI, because we see that more as a system can just read the document and identify information versus being really intelligent in replacing the work that humans are doing today. So if you're evaluating putting AI in your procurement process, the key thing to understand is not all software vendors are the same, and most of that what is sold today as AI is pretty much the same old kind of OCR along with some little bit of help, right, on chatbots and so on. So at a very fundamental level, AI really automates the process by learning from your data. And if it is not doing that and it is not replacing a step, then it is not really AI. So what is not really AI is a rule engine that can route the request for approvals based on the amount. What is AI is it can actually read your purchasing policy and dynamically generate approvals based on where it needs to go, or it can see how we have resolved this exception or an issue in the past and then automatically do it for you. That is the difference between, what is real AI versus what is just, for namesake, somebody's putting a sticker on their existing software. All right, let's now break it into two major buckets to kind of give you more idea about what I'm talking here. So we break AI into two buckets. One is augmented AI and second is autonomous AI. Augmented AI means it is supporting a process, but humans are still doing the work. So let's take an example. Let's say you have augmented AI, which give you suggestions on how to code an invoice. So maybe just say, hey, these are 2 or 3 possible options, and your AP team is actually picking one of those. Now it might have some sort of learning behind the scene for it to suggest what it needs to really kind of suggest to your AP team, but your AP team is still picking the code, right? That's kind of augmented AI. So the way to think about this is humans doing the work, but AI is making suggestions on how to make it faster. Now, the key bottleneck here is it doesn't fully automate the process. So if your AP person is out of the office, you still have to go in and wait for them to come back to actually finish the job, right? Now, let's look at the same example, but how an autonomous AI would work. So imagine a scenario where you have your existing historical data on how you code specific invoices based on your GL, project, whatever dimensions that you're using for your business. And the tool is actually doing the classification. It is automatically assigning the GL codes, it's automatically assigning projects and so on. And if it is sure, it just actually processes the whole invoice. It is not waiting for an input or somebody to just say, hey, yeah, go ahead and, because it looks great, right? So that's the difference. In augmented, it's still human driven, but it's supported by AI. And in autonomous, AI is actually doing the job for you and only raising exceptions where it cannot process those documents and just coming back to you and say, hey, I need help on these because I just couldn't do it on my own. So think about as a agent that never sleeps and just keeps on working on your invoices. And what that means is if you have autonomous AI doing the work, your team can now focus on other things. It frees up time for your accounting team and so on. So if you are struggling with headcounts, right, because your invoice volume has gone up or your PO volume has gone up, but you don't have enough headcount to kind of make it work, this is the right approach because your team can now focus on other areas. Now, most of the teams that are buying AI today is kind of more in the augmented AI phase, not in the autonomous AI. People are spending six figures. I've heard like a lot of places where they are putting in chatbots and so on. But honestly, it's still the human doing the work. So there is still dependency for somebody to kind of guide the process. And if they are out of office or your volume increase all of a sudden, you can't keep up with the volume. So it really doesn't solve the problem. So if you're in the market and evaluating an AI solution, I would clearly ask the vendor in terms of, is it augmented or is it autonomous? And if it is augmented, to what extent, where all we need to kind of jump in and provide inputs, or how much of the input it's going to provide. The other way to think about this is how much of my process would be automated using the AI process. All right, so real quick, if you want to see how other controllers are closing books in 2 to 3 days versus 7 to 10 days or 15 days, click on the link below to download a free playbook, a month-end close playbook that we have put together for you. It actually documents the entire process on how you can close books in 2 to 3 days. It kind of gives you a calendar for close. It also gives you automation triggers that you put in place, and it talks about 7 common bottlenecks that you must avoid to close books faster. So again, if you're closing the books like in the 7 to 15 days, I would say click on the link below and use that playbook today. Anyways, let's keep going. So before you implement any automation, you really have to understand how AI really works. AI works by identifying the patterns. Now, where those patterns come from, that comes from your data, because it is not like generative AI, right? You're not writing another email. You want a system which you can rely on to do the work for you and in a more autonomous way. So let's talk about the basic fundamentals, right? Where this data comes from, what processes are the systems you need in place to make sure AI can actually have good data or a solid foundation to build upon. So the first thing you need is a purchase order process. Instead of having Slack messages, emails, cryptic descriptions on what people are buying, if you have that today, your AI can't work because it doesn't have enough sound base to kind of work or automate the process, right? So what is really required is to have a system where you have a requisition for everything that is being purchased. So a detailed request information on what is being purchased, which, coding it is like what coding are you using there, right? Whether it is mapped to a GL, whether it's mapped to a project, maybe like the purpose of the spending is also important, right? If you are capturing all that, that's a solid foundation for AI to then automate your approval process, because now it understands how you're making decisions and what is the purpose of a purchase. So it can evaluate and say, is it really required, and who all needs to be involved based on your delegation of authority or your purchasing policy. The second thing it needs is clean supplier and coding data. So what we typically see when we start working with our clients on AI initiatives is if we have to train a model to do the job, it needs clean data. So let's say if you have multiple suppliers, let's take Amazon, Amazon Inc., Amazon Capital, or whatever the case might be, it has different variations, different spend patterns. So it always helps if we can just standardize those vendors and have one common variation. The second thing is coding standards. Coding standards are all over the place. You might have similar looking GL codes, and sometimes one is used versus others used. So it is important to take time to make sure that your coding structure is right, your projects that you have used in the past are clean, you're keeping up with if a project needs to be decommissioned or closed in your system, you're doing that. And the idea is that you're actually building the foundation for AI. As it goes through and understands the process, what you're using and the data, it can actually start predicting more and more information on its own, but it needs clean data. So those are two things. Now, the last foundation thing that you need for AI to work is integration with your accounting system. So if it is not connected to your accounting system, it cannot see past history or predict your, I would say, cash flow requirements by looking at your past history. The other thing that it needs to do is, no matter what you're using from an AI standpoint to code the invoices or route the invoice to the right person for approval, it still needs to go to your accounting system for it to record that transaction, right? So make sure that it is connected to your accounting system so it can understand the GL coding structure, any other dimensions that you're using, while also pushing the data back into your accounting system, which is your system of record. So without that, you have two different systems that doesn't talk to each other. That defeats the whole purpose. So if you build these foundations first, your tool becomes smarter over a period of time, and AI can actually start really working because now it understands your data, how you make decisions, and it can start replacing a lot of those manual processes for you. All right, now we got the basic foundations. Let's talk about how to implement AI within your organization. So the first thing where AI can help is the intake process. Intake is an employee going in and saying, I need to buy something. So there are key decisions that needs to be made here. First of all, who's your preferred vendor for this? What are they trying to buy? Understanding what really it is, right? So if somebody says, I need a laptop, okay, what kind of laptop do you need? Or you belong to engineering department, so I know there are certain standards defined already. I can give you recommendations. So it is actually replacing the buying function. It's acting as a buyer. So it's guiding your requesters or employees to the right vendor or to the right purchase, right? So it's kind of a, that is what I would call like a chatbot experience here, where it is actually working to provide back and forth. So that's number one, helping your employees to route to the right vendor or clarify the requirements on what they're looking to purchase. The second thing it can help with is approval routing. So traditionally, when you think about approval routing, it's defined based on rules. If it is over $500, it needs to go to so-and-so. If it is less than $500, it needs to go to so-and-so. Now, to a certain extent, you still need that. You still need a delegation of authority, because from a control standpoint, you need to have a policy which your auditors can audit and say, hey, per your policy, you need these 5 approvals, what they done or not. Where AI can help is make that approval process smarter. So let me give you an example. Let's say somebody goes in and put in a request for, hey, I need a project management software, and they select, let's say, Asana. I don't have any affiliation with any of these vendors. I'm using this as examples. But let's say now, if it gets approved per your standard policy, somebody goes in and buy those licenses. But now imagine this, the system is smart enough to figure out it's an IT purchase. I also need to add my IT manager, who can then review and say, oh, you know what? We already use, let's say, ClickUp as the system. You can just use us for the same. We don't need to buy more license, and maybe you already have free license that you can assign to them. So the idea here is that AI can help route to the right people for decisions and can help you control spending, right? So that's point number 2. Number 3, where AI can help the most, is matching of the invoices. So when the invoice comes in from the vendor, matching the invoice with the receipt and purchase order, and then figuring out what is going on. So there are a couple of use cases here. So let's talk about that. Number 1 is ingesting the invoice, matching it, and identifying any discrepancies. So the goal here should be that if AI can match the invoice with the receipt and the purchase order, you do not need to touch that invoice. It should be able to automatically process the invoice end to end and then send it to your accounting system. Or maybe there's an exception, then there are a couple of things it can do, right? So for example, in the past, if you have seen that every time an invoice or a price exception happens, it needs to go to Joe in the purchasing department. Joe then needs to reach out to the vendor. Instead of doing that, you can guide AI to say, hey, you know what? If there's a price exception and the invoice price does not match the purchase order, go ahead and send it to the vendor automatically and ask them for clarification. So it avoids the step of somebody manually reviewing it. And even if it still doesn't get resolved, only then send it to human. this is an example of how you kind of look at it. Or maybe receiving is an issue, right? So you invoices for 10 widgets and your receipt says 8. So asking those clarification questions, which generally a human is doing, AI can do the interaction back and forth, make a decision, and move on. And the last thing AI can help with is spend visibility and analytics. So once you have all the data in a single place, it's easier to go in and then ask questions around, hey, can you use my historical data to give me a cash flow visibility for the next 6 months, for example? Or if the trend continues for what we are seeing peaks in expenses, what my expense would be in the next 12 months. So you can use it for forecasting, and also it can give you real-time visibility where instead of waiting for the month-end close, all your data is in one single place. You're able to interact with the data and ask better questions. If you're a CFO, rather than going to your controller and say, show me my top 10 vendors and why the spend is higher, you can ask AI. It can actually look at the data and say, all right, spend went higher because you did XYZ, and these are the reasons what was provided to me. So you can kind of relate with it, whether it is directionally correct or you need to intervene and see why the spending is going up. Now, AI can speed up the AP process for you, but if your team is still spending 7 to 10 days to close books, that is where most of the time is going. So click on the link below. We have actually put together a playbook for you to how you can reduce your books close time from 7-10 days to 2 to 3 days. And it kind of walks you through step-by-step process. It gives you a calendar that you can start implementing. It also gives you automation triggers, things you should look for automating and making the process more smoother, and 7 common pitfalls that you must avoid to close your books on time. Again, click on the first link to download the playbook. And if you're curious whether Bill.com is worth the investment, be sure to check this next video.